In 1953, 17 people entered a basement in northern Massachusetts. By dawn, 10 were dead, and none of the survivors would ever speak of what happened, the blood patterns on the walls. The authorities could never explain them. If you are intrigued, stay until the end, because what we are about to reveal goes beyond the official investigations. Leave a comment from where you are watching and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's go to the beginning of everything. The small town of Millfield, Massachusetts, had always been unremarkable. Nestled between rolling hills and thick forests, it was a place where life moved at a predictable pace. The summer of 1953 had been particularly warm, the kind that made storefront owners leave their doors open and children play in sprinklers until dusk. Main Street was lined with family businesses that had operated for generations: Caldwell's General Store, Merritt's Pharmacy, and the Millfield Gazette, run by Thomas Hargrove, a third-generation newsman with wire-rimmed glasses and perpetually ink-stained fingers. At the edge of town stood the Millfield Community Church, a white clapboard building with a modest steeple that had weathered nearly a century of New England seasons. Reverend James Palmer had led the congregation for 22 years. He was known for his gentle sermons and community involvement. The church basement hosted everything from ladies' quilting circles to town meetings. Edward Miller moved to Millfield in 1948. A veteran returned from the Pacific Theater. He carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had seen too much, but chose to speak of it rarely. He opened a small bookshop on Main Street, selling both new releases and rare editions. Locals found him polite but reserved. He lived alone in a modest house on Elm Street, kept a small garden, and attended church most Sundays. What few people knew was that Edward had returned from war with more than just physical scars. According to military records obtained decades later, he had been temporarily hospitalized for what doctors then called combat fatigue, stretches of insomnia punctuated by vivid nightmares. He had been treated and released, deemed fit to return to civilian life. The records noted his heightened religious convictions developed during recovery. Catherine Walsh taught at Millfield Elementary School. At 32, she remained unmarried, unusual for the time but attributed to the shortage of eligible men after the war. She lived with her elderly mother in a small house near the school, attended church regularly, and was beloved by her students for her kindness and creativity. Her third-grade classroom was decorated with her own paintings of far-away places she'd read about but never seen. Township records show that Edward first spoke with Catherine after a church social in February 1949. Witnesses later described seeing them in conversation near the refreshment table, Edward speaking animatedly while Catherine listened with increasing interest. By spring, they were often seen walking together after Sunday service. Their friendship raised few eyebrows. In the town rebuilding after war, seeing a veteran finding companionship was considered a positive development. What nobody knew was what they discussed during those long walks through Millfield's quiet streets. According to Catherine's journal, found sealed in her sister's attic in 1977, their conversations frequently turned to religious matters. Edward spoke of visions he'd had during the war, moments when he believed divine intervention had saved him. He described angels unlike any in Scripture, beings of pure purpose who communicated through blood, the universal life force, he called it. Edward speaks with such conviction, Catherine wrote in April 1949. His experiences seem so far beyond anything Reverend Palmer discusses in his sermons. I find myself thinking about his words long after our walks end. By summer, their walks extended to Edward's home, where Catherine would stay for hours. Neighbors thought little of it, assumed perhaps a romance was blooming. The reality, as later evidence would suggest, was far more disturbing. Edward had begun to show Catherine his private journals. Page after page filled with intricate drawings of what he claimed were angelic communications, symbols he'd seen in blood-splatter patterns during combat. Alongside the symbols were his interpretations, complex theological arguments, combining Christian doctrine with his own revelations. "I've never seen anything like his drawings," Catherine wrote. "They seem to pulse with meaning, though I cannot yet decipher them." Edward says this is natural, that understanding comes with time and dedication. What happened next would be pieced together years later through scattered evidence and reluctant testimony. Edward and Catherine began to meet with others, first just a few, then more, always in private homes, rotating locations. William Forrester, a local carpenter. Margaret Dunn, the widow who ran the town's small inn. Robert Jensen, a quiet man who worked at the train station. Harold Quinn, who had served with Edward and now worked at the lumber mill. By winter of 1949, there were 7 of them. They called themselves the Receivers, though this name would not become public knowledge for many years. They met weekly, alternating between homes. From outside, neighbors might have mistaken them for a book club or Bible study. Inside, something much stranger was taking shape. According to a partial transcript of Harold Quinn's interview with federal investigators in 1954, these meetings began with Edward sharing his interpretations of the blood symbols. He taught that conventional scripture had been corrupted over centuries, that true divine wisdom came through blood, the universal medium that connected all humans to each other and to higher realms. Miller was convincing, Quinn stated. He didn't rant or rave like you'd expect from a fanatic. He spoke softly, reasonably, asked questions that made you doubt what you'd always been taught, made his ideas seem like the most natural conclusions in the world. The group began to perform what Edward called receiving rituals. These started simply, small pinpricks to draw drops of blood, which would fall onto white paper. Edward would then interpret the patterns, claiming to translate divine guidance. The messages were initially comforting, reassurances of cosmic purpose, promises of eventual enlightenment. Catherine's journal entries from this period show a woman gradually becoming consumed by these practices. "Today, my blood revealed a symbol Edward says represents spiritual awakening," she wrote in January 1950. "The clarity I feel is overwhelming. How could I have spent so many years in conventional prayer without understanding the direct communion that was possible?" What makes this case so disturbing is how methodically Edward Miller expanded both the group's size and the scope of their rituals. There was no sudden leap into extremism. Each escalation was small, logical, preceded by philosophical justification. The blood rituals became more elaborate, but still caused no lasting harm. The theological framework grew more comprehensive, gradually replacing members' previous religious understandings. By spring of 1950, the group had grown to 12 members. They now met in the basement of Edward's home, which he had renovated specifically for their gatherings. White walls, white floor, white ceiling, the better to observe blood patterns, he explained. According to Harold Quinn's testimony, it was around this time that Edward introduced the concept of the communion of angels, a state where multiple members would contribute blood simultaneously, creating more complex patterns that supposedly contained deeper wisdom. Robert Jensen, the train station attendant, was the first to express doubts. According to Quinn, Jensen questioned why the messages always seemed to enhance Edward's authority within the group. This led to the first significant conflict among the receivers. Edward didn't get angry when Robert challenged him, Quinn stated. That's what was so unsettling. He just looked disappointed, said he understood doubt was part of the spiritual journey. But then he asked if Robert would be willing to receive a direct message, a personal communion. What happened next would later be identified as a turning point. Edward arranged a special ritual for Robert. In front of the group, larger amounts of blood were drawn, still not dangerous, but more than their usual practice. The pattern it formed was interpreted by Edward as a warning about spiritual contamination, about the dangers of doubt. Within 2 weeks, Robert Jensen left Millfield entirely. A letter to his sister in Boston, discovered during the subsequent investigation, mentioned only that Millfield no longer feels like home, and that he was troubled by recent events I cannot fully explain. His departure sent ripples of anxiety through the group, but rather than weakening their commitment, it seemed to strengthen it. According to Catherine's journal, Edward presented Jensen's departure as a necessary purification, evidence that their work was becoming too important to include those who weren't fully committed. In his absence, the rituals intensified. Blood was now collected in small bowls rather than drops on paper. The interpretations grew more specific. Instructions about members' personal lives, about recruiting those who could receive the truth, about preparing for the great revelation. What no investigator could ever fully determine was whether Edward Miller truly believed in his blood communion or whether it was a calculated manipulation from the start. The detailed journals found in his home presented a man who appeared genuinely convinced of his divine connection. Yet the systematic way he isolated his followers from their previous social connections suggested careful, strategic control. By late 1950, the receivers had established protocols that would later be recognized as classic cult behavior. Members were encouraged to distance themselves from non-believing friends and family. They contributed financially to the group's activities. They reported dreams and thoughts to Edward for interpretation. Most disturbingly, they began keeping journals of their blood communion experiences, creating a self-reinforcing belief system. But something would happen in January 1951 that would shake even Edward's carefully constructed world. During a group ritual, Catherine Walsh experienced what members later described as a direct transmission. While Edward was interpreting a blood pattern, Catherine began speaking in a monotone voice, describing angelic visions that differed significantly from Edward's teachings. According to multiple accounts, Edward initially appeared startled, then pleased. He declared this development a sign of the group's spiritual advancement. Catherine had become a receiver in her own right. But private entries in Edward's journal told a different story. C's episode presents complications. The others were deeply affected. Must determine if this represents genuine advancement or dangerous fragmentation. The dynamics of the receivers began to shift. While Edward remained the primary interpreter, Catherine now occasionally entered trance-like states during rituals, delivering messages that sometimes aligned with Edward's and sometimes diverged. The group became increasingly focused on determining which communications were pure and which might be contaminated. According to Harold Quinn's testimony, it was around this time that Edward introduced a new element to their theology, the concept of vessels. He taught that some individuals were specially designated to hold angelic essence. These vessels would eventually become living conduits, able to speak divine wisdom directly without the need for blood interpretation. Looking back, it's obvious he was responding to Catherine's new role, Quinn stated. He couldn't stop what was happening, so he incorporated it into the belief system, made it seem planned all along. But what nobody in the group realized was how drastically their perception of reality had already altered. None of them questioned why divine beings would communicate through blood patterns. None asked why these enlightened messages led primarily to greater devotion to Edward himself. The gradual nature of their indoctrination had rendered them unable to see the larger picture. In March 1951, the receivers began actively recruiting new members. No longer a secret group, they now approached selected individuals with carefully crafted introductions to their beliefs. Not everyone was receptive. Several townspeople reported strange conversations with Catherine Walsh or William Forrester about direct communion and angelic languages. Those who expressed interest were invited to Edward's home for what was described as a philosophical discussion. According to later accounts, these initial meetings were deliberately mild, focusing on existential questions, the limitations of traditional religion, and the possibility of more direct spiritual experiences. Only after several such meetings would the true nature of the group be revealed. By summer 1951, the receivers had grown to 17 members, approximately 1% of Millfield's population. Their activities remained largely below the radar of town authorities, though Reverend Palmer had noticed the absence of several former congregants from Sunday services. According to church records, Palmer visited Catherine Walsh's home in August, concerned about her months-long absence from church. The conversation, as he documented in a letter to his denominational supervisor, left him deeply troubled. Miss Walsh spoke with great animation about direct divine communication, but her explanations were fragmented and concerning. She showed me journal entries filled with symbols she claimed were angelic language. When I expressed concern, her manner changed dramatically, becoming cold and dismissive. She informed me that traditional channels of faith were obsolete. Palmer's letter represents the first documented external concern about what was happening in Millfield. Unfortunately, his supervisor's response suggested only continued pastoral outreach and prayer. No further action was taken. Meanwhile, inside the group, the dynamics continued to evolve in disturbing ways. Catherine's role as a vessel had expanded. During rituals, she now regularly spoke as what she claimed was an angelic presence called the messenger. Her normal personality seemed to recede entirely during these episodes. But wait, before we continue with what happened when the rituals intensified, me diz nos comentários, você conhece algum caso parecido? Deixa a tua curtida, isso faz diferença. Agora sim, vamos ao que ninguém nunca contou. Edward's journals from this period reveal growing tension. While publicly embracing Catherine's role, privately he wrote of concerning deviations and the need to realign the vessel. Most troublingly, he began documenting what he called purification methods, techniques to induce extreme emotional states that would supposedly prepare vessels for clearer transmission. These purification rituals began in September 1951. According to Harold Quinn's testimony, they involved sleep deprivation, fasting, and prolonged meditation while focusing on blood symbols. Catherine was the first to undergo the full purification, isolated in a room in Edward's basement for 3 days with minimal food and water. When she emerged, witnesses described her as transformed, gaunt, with an intense gaze and preternaturally calm demeanor. That evening, during a special gathering of all 17 members, Catherine experienced her most dramatic transmission yet. Speaking in a voice barely recognizable as her own, she delivered what would later be called the revelation of vessels. The message, as recorded in multiple members' journals, declared that the time had come for more vessels to be prepared. The angels required multiple channels to deliver their complete wisdom. The communion would soon enter a new phase where blood would no longer be needed. The angels would speak directly through prepared human vessels. Edward appeared to embrace this development enthusiastically. He designated 5 additional members as potential vessels, including Margaret Dunn and William Forrester. Each would undergo purification rituals of increasing intensity. What none of the members seemed to recognize was the dangerous path they were on. Medical records later revealed that Catherine Walsh was experiencing significant physical deterioration, weight loss, anemia, and signs of psychological distress disguised by religious fervor. The fall of 1951 marked a crucial escalation. The group, now calling itself the Vessel Communion, began conducting longer, more intensive rituals in Edward's basement. The White Room, as they called it, became the center of their activities. Blood rituals continued, but were now secondary to the preparation of vessels. According to police statements collected after the events of 1953, neighbors had begun to notice concerning patterns. Several group members stopped appearing at their jobs. Catherine Walsh took an extended leave of absence from teaching, citing health concerns. Lights in Edward's home burned through the night. Strange sounds, rhythmic chanting, occasional cries were sometimes heard by those living nearby, yet no one intervened. In the climate of 1950s, small-town America, direct confrontation about religious practices was uncommon. Concerns were expressed in whispers rather than official complaints. By winter, the purification rituals had intensified further. Sleep deprivation extended to 2 or 3 days. Fasting periods lengthened. According to Harold Quinn's testimony, it was during this period that Edward introduced a new element, a clear liquid he called clarifying essence, administered to vessels in preparation. Toxicology reports conducted years later on preserved samples would identify this substance as a combination of mild hallucinogens and stimulants. Nothing that would cause immediate harm, but substances that, combined with sleep deprivation and fasting, would significantly alter consciousness. The psychological manipulation had reached new heights. Edward had created a system where vessels competed for divine selection. Those experiencing the most dramatic transmissions received greater attention and status within the group. This created a feedback loop of escalating behavior, with members unconsciously performing to meet expectations. Catherine's role continued to evolve. By early 1952, she no longer participated as merely one vessel among many. She had become the primary, supposedly the purest channel for angelic communication. Her transmissions now directed the group's activities and beliefs. Edward presented himself merely as the interpreter of her messages, though his journals reveal his careful management of her states and statements. What makes this case so disturbing is the deliberate documentation. The members didn't hide their activities. They recorded them meticulously, believing they were preserving divine wisdom for future generations. These records would later provide investigators with unprecedented insight into the group's descent into collective psychosis. Spring 1952 brought the first public incident. During a shopping trip to the general store, Margaret Dunn, one of the vessels, experienced a spontaneous transmission in front of several customers. Witnesses described her suddenly speaking in a monotone voice about blood opening the doorway and vessels preparing to receive. When the store owner attempted to help her, believing she was ill, she became physically aggressive before William Forrester arrived to escort her away. This incident triggered the first official concern. The store owner reported the disturbance to Millfield's police chief, Robert Harris. According to department records, Harris visited Edward's home the following day for what was described as a wellness check on Margaret. The report filed afterward was brief. Spoke with Mr. Miller and Mrs. Dunn. She appeared tired but coherent, explained recent emotional stress due to anniversary of husband's passing. No signs of distress or coercion observed. Religious books and artwork noted in home. No cause for further investigation. What the report didn't mention was that Edward had been expecting such a visit. Quinn's testimony revealed that the group had prepared for potential interference, clearing the basement of ritual items and coaching members on appropriate responses to authorities. Following this incident, Edward relocated the group's most intensive activities to a more remote location, an abandoned hunting cabin on property owned by Harold Quinn's family, approximately 5 miles outside town. The White Room in Edward's basement remained their primary meeting place, but purification rituals and vessel transmissions now occurred at the cabin, away from potential observation. The isolation accelerated the group's detachment from reality. Without even casual contact with outsiders to ground them, their shared delusions intensified. The vessels, now numbering 7, reported increasingly elaborate communications from angels. These messages grew more apocalyptic, warnings about the coming cleansing and the selection of the worthy. Edward's journals from summer 1952 reveal his struggle to maintain control of the narrative. Catherine's transmissions had begun incorporating elements he hadn't introduced. references to ancient civilizations and cosmic cycles that weren't part of his original theology. Rather than contradicting these additions, he expanded the belief system to accommodate them, creating an increasingly Byzantine cosmology. Medical records obtained from Dr. James Wilson, Millfield's general practitioner, indicate that several group members sought treatment for physical ailments during this period: exhaustion, unexplained weight loss, persistent headaches. In each case, they provided natural explanations: work stress, minor illness, and rejected suggestions of more thorough examination. Dr. Wilson's private notes, discovered after his death in 1978, express concern about Catherine Walsh specifically. Third visit in 2 months. Patient exhibits signs of malnutrition and possible anemia. Unusual effect. Alternates between extreme calm and agitation when questioned closely. Refuses blood tests or referral to specialist. Legal and ethical limitations prevent intervention without clear evidence of self-harm. What no outside observer realized was that the group had begun preparing for what Edward called the Great Communion, a culminating ritual that would supposedly allow permanent angelic presence within the vessels. His private journals detailed elaborate preparations, including construction of specialized equipment in the cabin's basement. Police photographs taken after the events of 1953 show this equipment: 7 chairs arranged in a circle, each with restraints disguised as stabilization aids, a complex system of tubing connecting to central collection vessels, a modified phonograph that played the same recorded tone for hours, white walls covered with blood symbols accumulated over months of rituals. The planning was meticulous, deliberate, and entirely delusional. Edward believed, or claimed to believe, that the simultaneous opening of all 7 vessels would create a permanent conduit for angelic wisdom. The non-vessel members would serve as anchors and witnesses to the transformation. By winter 1952, the group had withdrawn almost completely from public life. Several members had quit jobs or taken extended leaves. Catherine had resigned from teaching entirely. They spent most of their time either at Edward's home or the cabin, preparing for the Great Communion, scheduled for the spring equinox, March 21st, 1953. According to Harold Quinn's testimony, disagreements began to emerge as the date approached. 2 members, Thomas Garrett and Elizabeth Hale, expressed concerns about the increasingly extreme nature of the purification rituals. Edward's response was to identify them as compromised by doubt and exclude them from inner circle activities. This would prove fortunate for them both. Neither was present for the events of March 21st. Both would later provide crucial testimony to investigators, though their accounts were limited by their exclusion from the final months of preparation. The surviving planning documents reveal the schedule for March 21st in clinical detail. The 7 vessels would undergo final purification for 3 days prior: no food, minimal water, continued doses of the clarifying essence, and constant exposure to recorded chanting and tones. The 10 non-vessel members would prepare the ritual space, transcribe the final individual transmissions, and anchor the vessels during the Great Communion. What actually occurred on March 21st has been reconstructed from physical evidence and the traumatized testimonies of survivors. The vessels, in states of extreme physical and psychological distress, were seated in the prepared chairs. According to plan, small incisions were made to allow blood collection, supposedly to create the final communicative medium between vessels and angels. The exact sequence of events remains unclear. Harold Quinn's testimony suggests that Catherine Walsh, severely weakened by months of malnutrition and sleep deprivation, began experiencing genuine medical distress approximately 2 hours into the ritual. Rather than recognizing this as an emergency, Edward interpreted her symptoms as the beginning of permanent communion and accelerated the ritual. Physical evidence indicates that as Catherine's condition deteriorated, The other vessels began experiencing extreme psychological reactions, likely panic responses intensified by their physical condition and the drugs in their systems. Several broke free from their restraints. In the chaos that followed, equipment was overturned, including candles that ignited flammable ritual materials. The fire spread rapidly through the wooden cabin. Of the 17 members present, only 7 managed to escape. Catherine Walsh, Edward Miller, and 8 others died of a combination of smoke inhalation, physical trauma, and medical complications from their weakened state. The official investigation initially focused on the fire itself. Only when authorities entered Edward's home and discovered the White Room, with its years of documented rituals, did the true nature of events begin to emerge. The scope of the investigation expanded dramatically, involving state police and eventually federal authorities concerned about potential wider cult activities. The survivors provided limited testimony. Most were so deeply indoctrinated that even faced with the tragic outcome, they struggled to recognize the manipulation they had experienced. Harold Quinn proved the exception. Having been more recently elevated to the inner circle, he retained enough perspective to eventually understand what had happened, though his debriefing took months. What makes this case so deeply disturbing is not just the loss of life, but the meticulously documented descent into collective delusion. Edward Miller's earliest journals reveal someone struggling with trauma and religious obsession, possibly genuinely believing in his blood communications. But as time progressed, his writings show increasing calculation, documenting techniques to maintain control, while allowing followers to believe they were experiencing divine revelation. The blood symbolism that formed the core of the group's practices has been analyzed by psychologists and religious scholars. The consensus view is that Edward likely experienced pareidolia, the tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in random stimuli during combat trauma. Rather than recognizing these as psychological phenomena, he built an elaborate theological framework around them, one that eventually consumed not only his life, but the lives of 16 others. Perhaps most unsettling are the interviews with Millfield residents conducted in the aftermath. Neighbor after neighbor described noticing concerning changes in group members, but feeling unable or unwilling to intervene. The social norms of the time, combined with respect for religious freedom and personal privacy, created a perfect environment for isolation and abuse to flourish undetected. Reverend Palmer's testimony to investigators revealed his profound regret. "I knew something was wrong." The changes in Catherine, in all of them, were obvious to anyone who had known them before. But I told myself it wasn't my place to intrude on another's spiritual journey. I prayed for them instead of acting. God forgive me for that failure. In the years following the tragedy, several academic studies examined what became known as the Millfield incident. These analyses identified key warning signs that community members missed or misinterpreted. The gradual isolation of members, physical deterioration disguised as spiritual devotion, escalating extremism in beliefs and practices, and the careful cultivation of an us versus them mentality that made outside intervention nearly impossible. The town of Millfield never fully recovered from the tragedy. Tourism declined, several businesses closed. The population gradually diminished as younger residents moved away, unwilling to live under the shadow of what had happened. By 1970, Millfield was officially designated a declining community by state economic planners. Edward Miller's bookshop remained boarded up for nearly a decade, before finally being sold to new owners who converted it to an antique store. Local rumors claimed it was haunted, though such supernatural explanations pale next to the documented horror of what actually occurred. Catherine Walsh's house was eventually sold to a young family from Boston who knew nothing of its history. According to town records, they stayed less than 6 months before moving away, citing uncomfortable atmosphere as their reason for departure. The house changed hands several more times, never occupied for more than a year, before being demolished in 1968. The cabin site was never rebuilt. The land remained in the Quinn family, though Harold sold his stake and moved to California immediately after the investigation concluded. Aerial photographs from 1965 show the clearing grown over, nature reclaiming the space where so much human tragedy had unfolded. What of the survivors? Their paths diverged dramatically in the aftermath. Harold Quinn's cooperation with authorities led to his eventual recovery, though according to his therapist's notes, he struggled with guilt and nightmares for decades. He changed his name and built a new life in San Diego, eventually becoming an advocate for cult awareness and prevention. Elizabeth Hale and Thomas Garrett, the two who had expressed doubts and been excluded, suffered less severe psychological trauma, but still required extensive therapy. Both eventually left Massachusetts, seeking places where they weren't known in connection with the tragedy. The 4 other survivors proved more concerning to authorities. Despite witnessing the deadly outcome of their beliefs, they maintained that Edward had been correct, that the deaths represented not failure but transcendence. According to psychiatric evaluations, they had become so deeply indoctrinated that they reinterpreted even the most traumatic evidence to support their belief system. These 4 were eventually released after psychiatric evaluation determined they posed no threat to themselves or others, though their persistent delusions concerned authorities. They formed a smaller group that continued to meet privately for several years, though without the extreme practices of the original vessel communion. Their ultimate fates remain largely undocumented. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the case is how little public attention it received at the time. A few newspaper articles, quickly forgotten, brief mention in several academic journals specializing in religious studies or abnormal psychology. The events occurred just before the rise of mass media coverage of cult activities that would come in later decades. It was only in 1978, when Dr. Wilson's private notes were discovered after his death, that renewed interest in the case emerged. A graduate student named Rebecca Lang found references to the incident while researching a dissertation on religious extremism in post-war America. Her subsequent investigation, including interviews with surviving Millfield residents and review of previously sealed records, resulted in the first comprehensive account of the tragedy. Lang's research revealed additional disturbing details. Edward Miller had apparently attempted to form similar groups in 2 previous locations before settling in Millfield. In both cases, he had attracted small followings before local resistance caused him to move on. Millfield, with its combination of post-war disorientation and traditional respect for privacy, provided the perfect environment for his ideas to take root and flourish unchecked. Lang also discovered evidence suggesting Catherine Walsh may have had undiagnosed temporal lobe epilepsy, a condition sometimes associated with intense religious experiences and visions. This medical vulnerability, combined with Edward's manipulation, could explain her rapid transformation from respected teacher to vessel medium. The blood patterns that formed the basis of the group's practices were analyzed by forensic experts as part of Lang's research. Their conclusion was unambiguous. The patterns were entirely random, with meaning imposed rather than inherent. Edward's elaborate interpretations were pure confabulation, though whether he was consciously deceiving his followers or had himself become convinced of his interpretations remains impossible to determine conclusively. Yet questions linger about the investigation itself. Several sealed federal documents, partially released through Freedom of Information Act requests in 1992, suggest authorities may have had concerns beyond the immediate tragedy. References to potential pattern recognition and similar symbolic systems imply investigators may have identified connections to other groups or belief systems that were never made public. What's certain is that the investigation ended rather abruptly in late 1953. The official conclusion cited isolated religious extremism as the cause, with no wider threat identified. Yet internal memos question whether all evidence was thoroughly examined, particularly materials found in a locked chest in Edward's attic that were never detailed in public reports. A history professor at Boston University who reviewed the case in 2004 noted troubling inconsistencies. The investigation appears to have been comprehensive in documenting what happened, but curiously limited in exploring why. Cultural context of the early Cold War era may have influenced authorities to avoid deeper questions about how seemingly ordinary Americans could embrace such extreme beliefs. It was more comfortable to view it as an isolated aberration than to consider systemic vulnerabilities. The final police photographs, taken just before the cabin site was released back to the Quinn family, show a scene of profound desolation. The charred remains of the structure, the ritual chairs, partially burned but still recognizable, and most disturbing, the walls, where blood patterns remained visible despite the fire damage. Forensic analysis confirmed all blood came from group members. No evidence of outside victims was ever found, yet the quantity was substantial, suggesting months or years of accumulation. The patterns themselves appeared random to objective observers, yet the group had built an entire cosmology around their supposed meaning. But before we continue with what happened when the rituals intensified, tell me in the comments, do you know of any similar case? Leave a like, it makes a difference. Now then, let's get to what no one ever told. In December 2001, a local historian in Millfield discovered something previously overlooked. While reorganizing town archives, she found a sealed envelope containing a short statement from Police Chief Harris, apparently written shortly before his retirement in 1967, but never filed officially. The statement describes his final visit to the cabin site in 1953, after the investigation had officially concluded. I returned alone to perform a final inspection before releasing the scene. What I found has troubled me for 14 years, yet I've never reported it officially, fearing ridicule or misinterpretation. The north wall of the basement, previously documented as covered with blood symbols, had changed. Despite no one having entered the site for weeks, the patterns appeared different. Several had shifted position, others had faded entirely. Most disturbing, a new pattern had appeared near the center, one distinctly resembling a human face twisted in anguish. Scientific explanation likely exists, natural deterioration, environmental factors, yet standing alone in that charred room, I could not shake the impression of something still active in that space. I ordered the site bulldozed the following day, an action beyond my authority but which I deemed necessary. I have not spoken of this to anyone until now. Harris's statement was dismissed by later reviewers as the imagination of an aging man troubled by his connection to tragedy. The historian who discovered it noted his health had been declining when it was written. Yet the bulldozing of the site, confirmed by county records, occurred much earlier than previously thought, and without proper authorization. In the decades since, Millfield has slowly faded. The population today is less than 500. The church where Edward first met Catherine still stands, though services are held only monthly with a visiting pastor. Most residents have no direct memory of the events of 1953, though local law preserves distorted versions of the story. What remains undisputed is that 17 ordinary people, over the course of 5 years, were gradually led to believe that angels spoke through blood, that this belief became so all-consuming that it overrode self-preservation, rational thought, and everything they had previously held true, and that this happened not through sudden conversion, but through a process so gradual that neither they nor those around them recognized the danger until it was too late. The psychology of such gradual indoctrination has been studied extensively since, how small concessions lead to larger ones, how isolation reinforces shared delusions, how charismatic leadership can subvert rational thought. The Millfield incident now appears in textbooks as a case study in cult dynamics and cognitive manipulation, but cold academic analysis fails to capture the human tragedy. Catherine Walsh's final journal entry, dated March 18, 1953, 3 days before her death, reveals someone simultaneously lost in delusion, yet retaining fragments of her former self. The preparation is nearly complete. The vessels are purified. Soon the angels will speak not through blood, but through us directly. Sometimes in quiet moments I remember my classroom, my students' faces. Did I abandon them? Or am I fulfilling a greater purpose that will eventually benefit all? Edward assures me the latter is true. The clarity I feel during transmissions convinces me he's right. Yet in between, questions surface. No matter. After the Great Communion, there will be no more questions, no more doubt. Only certainty. The sealed federal files on the Millfield incident are scheduled for complete declassification in 2028, 75 years after the events they document. Perhaps then, the final questions will be answered about what truly happened in that small New England town and whether authorities found connections to other, similar groups that have never been publicly acknowledged. The site of Edward Miller's home remains vacant, a grassy lot between two well-maintained houses on Elm Street. Locals say nothing will grow in certain parts of the yard. Soil analysis reveals only slightly elevated iron content, likely from the substantial amount of blood that soaked into the ground beneath the White Room. The final disturbing detail emerged in 1997, when construction workers excavating for a new gas line discovered a sealed metal box buried approximately 4 feet beneath what had been Edward Miller's garden. Inside were 78 blood-stained papers, apparently the earliest of Edward's communications. Expert analysis revealed something Edward's followers never knew. The blood on these original papers wasn't human. Laboratory tests identified it as primarily pig blood, likely obtained from the local butcher where Edward had been known to shop regularly. Only later samples, once he had established his authority, transitioned to human blood drawn from followers. This discovery suggests a level of calculated deception from the very beginning, that Edward may have orchestrated the entire belief system as a means of obtaining power, control, and devotion. Yet his private journals contain passages of such convinced fervor that many researchers believe he eventually came to believe his own creation, a phenomenon known as the deceiver becoming deceived. The Millfield incident stands as a stark reminder of human psychological vulnerability, how the need for meaning, community, and transcendence can be manipulated with devastating consequences. It demonstrates how easily reality can be subverted when changes occur gradually and within a closed system of reinforcement. The files remain in the FBI archives, labeled simply Millfield, 1953. The blood-stained papers are preserved in a climate-controlled facility at a university research center, their patterns still visible but faded with time. And somewhere, perhaps, the last surviving members of the vessel communion still carry the mental scars of their experience, still wondering if the angels truly spoke through blood. The Hunt Cabins Foundation was finally removed in 1972. Workers reported unusual staining in the concrete that resisted cleaning. The land remains undeveloped, visible only as a clearing in satellite images of the surrounding forest. Local teenagers occasionally venture there on dares, though most quickly leave, describing an oppressive feeling they can't explain. What's perhaps most unsettling is how easily the pattern could repeat, how vulnerable we remain to manipulation when it arrives not as obvious extremism, but as gradual shifts in perception, reinforced by community and clothed in the familiar language of meaning and purpose. The archives were sealed. The blood samples were destroyed in 1964, but one question remains unanswered. Why did Chief Harris, a rational man by all accounts, order the cabin site destroyed without authorization? His statement mentions patterns that moved and changed when no one was present. This detail was redacted from public reports. 7 decades later, no one who knows the truth remains alive. So what did you think? Comment your theory about what really happened. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any story. Until the next case.